Okay, let's first practice using the output method. The table here shows how much each country can produce using the same amount of resources. The US can produce 20 cars or 40 corn, while the UK can produce 10 cars or 30 corn. Well, who produces more in this situation? Well, 20 is greater than 10 and 40 is greater than 30, so the US has the absolute advantage in both goods. But who has the comparative advantage? Well, for that, we need to use OOO. Okay, for the US, we need to find the opportunity cost for producing cars. Well, if we use OOO, we put 40 over 20, and 40 over 20 is 2, so the opportunity cost for one car is 2 corn. And we could do the same thing for corn. For that, we put the other over the one we're finding, and 20 over 40 is 0.5. And we could do that for every single box, and we find out who has the lower opportunity cost. Well, 2 is lower than 3, and 1/3 is lower than 0.5. So the US should specialize in cars, while the UK should specialize in corn. Now let's move on to input method. This time, instead of being given output, we're being given how many hours it takes to produce each good. Well, the US needs 5 hours to produce a car and 2 hours to produce corn, while the UK needs 4 hours to produce a car and only 1 hour to produce corn. Okay, let's first find who has the absolute advantage. Instead of going for the bigger number here, smaller means better. So, 4 is smaller than 5 and 1 is smaller than 2. So the UK has the absolute advantage in both goods. Okay, but who has the comparative advantage? Well, to find the opportunity cost this time, instead of using OOO, we use IOU. Other goes under. Okay, so if we put 2 under 5, that becomes 5 over 2, which is 2.5. And we could find the opportunity cost for all of these boxes. And then we find who has a lower opportunity cost, and then that's how we find the comparative advantage in the input questions. The US should specialize in cars, while the UK should specialize in corn. Okay, now I'm going to show you a cheat sheet to help determine who should specialize in what faster. Okay, so for output questions, all you have to do is multiply the numbers diagonally, and 20 times 30 is 600, and 10 times 40 is 400. Because this is an output question, we have to find who has the bigger number. Well, in this case, 600 is bigger than 400, so the US should specialize in cars and the UK should specialize in corn. Okay, but now let's look at the input method. This time, smaller is better. Because we're looking at hours, we have to find who uses less hours. So the US, again, has a smaller number, so the US has a comparative advantage in cars. Okay, it's time for another quiz. Pause this video and read this question very carefully. Okay, first look at alpha. Alpha can make 60 wheat or 30 steel. That means every 1 steel costs alpha 2 wheat. Now look at beta. Beta can make 40 wheat or 40 steel. So for beta, 1 steel costs 1 wheat. Comparative advantage looks at opportunity cost, not who makes more. Since beta gives up less wheat to make steel, beta has the comparative advantage in steel. But that also means alpha has the comparative advantage in wheat. For trade to be mutually beneficial, the terms of trade must fall between their opportunity costs. Beta is willing to trade steel for more than 1 wheat, and alpha is willing to trade steel for no more than 2 wheat. So the acceptable range is between 1 and 2 wheat per steel. And looking at the choices, 1 steel for 2 wheat fits that rule. That's why the correct answer is B. Now let's move on to the final topic for this unit, which is demand, supply, market equilibrium, and the circular flow. In economics, demand is not just about wanting something, but demand means the willingness and ability to buy at different prices. On this graph here, the price is on the vertical axis while the quantity is on the horizontal axis, and the demand curve slopes downward. And there's actually 3 main reasons for that. First is the substitution effect. When the price of something goes up, people look for alternatives. For example, like Coke and Pepsi. If a price of a can of Coke suddenly jumps to $10 per can, then more people will rush to buy Pepsi. However, very few true Coke enthusiasts may still pay that $10 per can, but there's still very little demand for a Coke can that costs $10. And second, it's the income effect. When prices rise, your purchasing power falls. Let's say you only have $20 a month to spend on your morning coffee, but the price of that increases. You can't buy the same amount of coffee. Even if your income doesn't change, things can feel a lot more expensive. And third, it's the law of diminishing marginal utility. And this one's important. As consumption increases, the satisfaction from each additional unit decreases. Let's say it's 3 a.m. and you're like very thirsty in the middle of the night. And you go and get a cup of water. That first cup of water, your satisfaction is at peak. But when you take another cup of water, it's not as good. And eventually, you get super full and you hate the thought of drinking another cup. Okay, now let's talk about shifts. A good way to remember this is the acronym TIMER. T stands for taste and preferences, I stands for income, market stands for market size or number of buyers, E stands for the expectations of future prices, and or just the future in general, and R stands for related good prices like substitutes and complements. So demand is really just about behavior. It shows how consumers respond to prices, income, and preferences, and how much satisfaction they get from each additional unit. Okay, now here's where some students make mistakes. A lot of students tend to mix up change in quantity demanded and the change in demand. Okay, firstly, it's moving along the demand curve, and this is called a change in quantity demanded. And this happens for just one reason: price changes. When price falls, quantity demanded increases, and when price rises, quantity demanded decreases. And nothing else has changed. Preferences didn't change, income didn't change. It's just the same demand curve, but you're just moving from one point to another. Now, look here on the right. This is completely different. This is a shift of the entire demand curve, and we call this a change in demand. Here, price is not the cause. Again, price is not the cause. Something else changed, and it's one of the non-price factors, which is going to be your timer. And when demand increases, the curve shifts right, and when demand decreases, the curve shifts left. On the exam, if you use the wrong phrase, quantity demanded versus demand, it can cost you an entire point. So make sure you take note of this. Alright, now I'm going to quickly move through supply because conceptually, it's the same thing as demand. Just switch your perspective. Demand was about buyers, but now we're talking about sellers. Okay, supply just means the willingness and ability to sell at different prices. And the supply curve slopes upward, and this is because of the law of supply. As the price of a good increases, the quantity supplied increases, and vice versa. So why does this work? Well, it's because of three main reasons. First, it's the profit motive. Higher prices means higher potential profit, so firms want to produce more. And secondly, it's the increasing marginal cost. To produce more, firms must use less efficient resources, which raises costs over time. And third, it's incentives. Higher prices attract more production effort and sometimes more sellers. Now, look at demand. We have an acronym to memorize the different shifts, but this time it's ROTTEN. ROTTEN stands for resource costs, other goods prices, technology, taxes and subsidies, expectations of future prices, and number of sellers. If any of these change, the entire supply curve shifts. Now, just like demand, the same rules apply to supply. Changing quantity supplied or price is movement along the curve, while a change in supply or a non-price factor, your ROTTEN, it's the entire curve shifting. Now let's put demand and supply together. The equilibrium is where both curves intersect. At equilibrium, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, and there's no pressure for a price to change. Buyers are satisfied and sellers are also satisfied, and that price is the equilibrium price. But what happens when a market is not at equilibrium? We call it disequilibrium. And disequilibrium just means the quantity demanded does not equal to quantity supplied. Okay, first, price is set above the equilibrium. And this could happen due to many different reasons, which we'll cover later on. When prices are too high, quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, and that creates a surplus. Sellers have excess goods sitting unsold, so they'll lower prices to get rid of them. And as price falls, the market moves back towards equilibrium. And second, it's when price is set below the equilibrium. When price is too low, quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, and that creates a shortage. Buyers compete with each other, and sellers respond by raising prices. As price rises, the market again moves back toward equilibrium. Surpluses push price down, and shortages push price up. Now let's talk about what actually changes the equilibrium. A change in equilibrium happens only when demand or supply shifts, not price changes or movement along the curve. That shift creates a temporary surplus or shortage, which pushes price or quantity to a new equilibrium. And there's actually only 4 cases. But I suggest not memorizing this, but instead thinking through what actually happens when demand or supply shifts. For example, a decrease in demand means fewer people want to get a good at every price. As a result, firms are left with extra inventory or a surplus, and to get rid of the surplus, producers lower the price, which encourages more consumers to buy. And as price falls, the quantity exchange in the market also falls, leading to a lower equilibrium price and a lower equilibrium quantity. And the same logic applies to all 4 cases. If you focus on who has the excess, you can always predict how price and quantity adjust, even without memorization. But what happens when demand and supply shifts at the same time? Well, one variable has to be indeterminate. So in the case of where, let's say, demand increases and supply decreases, what's going to happen? Well, in this animation here, in both cases, price surely moved up. But what about quantity? Quantity either moved to the right or to the left. So quantity is a variable that's indeterminate. If you want a more detailed explanation of this, check out the AP Micro Unit 2 video. Let's zoom out and see the economy as a simple loop. This is a circular flow model, and there are 4 players here: households, businesses, and the governments, and the 2 markets that connect everything: the product market on the top and the factor market on the bottom. Okay, let's start with the real stuff we see every day. In the factor market, households provide the inputs businesses need, like land, labor, and capital. And businesses use those inputs to produce output, which gets sold in the product market as goods and services. Then those goods and services flow back into the households. So the yellow arrows are basically inputs go to businesses and finished products come back to people. Okay, now let's add the money. Households spend money in the product market, and that's your daily spending. That spending becomes revenue for business. Then businesses pay households for their resources in the factor market, like wages for labor, rent for land, interest for capital, and profit for entrepreneurs. And that payment becomes household income. So green arrows are the money loop, from spending to revenue to income to spending again. But now let's add in the government. Households and businesses both have to pay taxes, to the government. Then the government uses that money to provide public goods and services like roads, national defense, public schools, and infrastructure that supports the whole economy. Finally, notice how the government is doing both in both markets. In the factor market, the government uses resources too, like hiring workers or buying land for projects, and in the product market, it spends money on goods and services. This is a government expenditure. So the full picture is real resources and goods flow one way, while the money flows the other way, and the government connects the entire system through taxes and spending. Wow, that was a lot. Thank you for watching, and see you in Unit 2.